On this edition, I'm going to talk about Nate Diaz and his future in the lightweight division. Now, Nate Diaz is a very young fighter. He's fought in two different divisions in his mixed martial arts career. He was fighting in welterweight in the past couple of years. He had some very good fights, some good wins, and then he had some very disappointing losses. I think that really culminated with the fight against Rory McDonald, where he was tossed around like a rag doll, and his game was exposed. He couldn't box, couldn't wrestle, couldn't grapple. Nothing was really working in that fight. Then he decided to make the move back down to lightweight. And at lightweight, he's really come into his own with the impressive win over Gomi, with the huge win over Donald Cerrone, then defeating Jim Miller. Now, what I want to do is really just talk about just a couple aspects in regards to Nate Diaz. And when Nate Diaz was fighting at welterweight, people were saying, Nate Diaz is never going to materialize into this good fighter. He'll always be a tough fighter. He'll always put on entertaining fights and put on exciting fights, but he'll never be an upper echelon fighter. Well, he's technically been proving a lot of people wrong lately, and I think a lot of it has to do with people were very quick to jump the gun, and in anything, Nate Diaz was still growing as a mixed martial artist. Let's not forget that Nate is 27 years old, and he still has a lot of growing to do. However, he's just hitting his stride right now. I think he's really coming into his own in the lightweight division now. If we're talking about, I want to talk about the prime of his game, but Nate Diaz is pretty darn close to it being the prime of his game, and it really did show in the win against Jim Miller. Jim Miller had no answer for the guy. So I think for people to say, oh, Nate Diaz will never be this good fighter, well, you were speaking a little too soon, is that Nate's really come a long way. He's turned into a pretty darn good mixed martial artist, and he's at the top of the lightweight division now. I mean, he's had 3 straight wins in a row against 3 very tough opponents, and I don't want to say they were one-sided, but he put on impressive performances. So he's 27 years old, he's got a lot of growing to do, and he's really evolved as a mixed martial artist. Is he not a wrestler still? Is that still a hole in his game? Yes, but he makes up for it with his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's another thing I wanted to talk about, is that Nate was recently awarded a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under the great Cesar Gracie, and going into the Jim Miller fight, Jim Miller's had a black belt for quite some time. Well, the first submission he threw on Jim Miller, he was able to lock up and finish a guy that has never been finished before. Not to mention, the current champion himself, Henderson, could not finish Jim Miller by submission. Now, I'm not here to compare fighters and say, well, he couldn't finish him and he couldn't do that. It's just simple facts here, is that, you know what, Nate Diaz made it look very easy, whereas Henderson, I don't want to say struggled, but Henderson really tried to lock in, tried to finish that fight, but he couldn't. But it was a one-side fight. He did beat Jim Miller down. However, Nate Diaz is one of the better submission guys in the division, and it says a lot, is that he recently awarded Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. It just shows, I don't want to say the learning curve, but how skilled of a submission expert this guy is. And on top of that, too, is his boxing. Every time Nate comes out, his boxing gets better and better, and it's been like that for quite some time. He's been a very formidable boxer, but in the Gomi fight, it was this huge step in just how much he's grown as a boxer. And then it even got even better in the fight with Donald Cerrone. He took one of the most feared strikers in the lightweight division, a guy that, very few people could stand up and trade with. And he absolutely dominated the guy. For the people who say, oh, Donald Cerrone's game plan, he wasn't focused for that fight, well, still, the fight happened. Nate Diaz won that fight, and he dominated that fight in impressive fashion. For 3 rounds, he put on the biggest beating that Donald Cerrone will never forget in his entire life. That was a beating. It was an impressive boxing performance, and that's the thing, is that Nate has no fear. His chin allows him to stand in the pocket and just throw strikes. But it's not just that it's sloppy. His technique is very good for a boxer. He stands in the pocket, throws a great 1-2. He finds the gaps. His boxing has come a long way. Now, I said that he has struggled with wrestlers in the past. You go back to the Jim Miller fight. Now it's one fight. For everybody to say, I'm not here to say that, oh, he's found the solution for wrestlers. No, he hasn't, but he's finding a way to do so. I think he came out in very good shape for the fight with Jim Miller. He looked a lot stronger in that fight, and Jim Miller could not really get him down to the ground and bully him like a lot of us thought he would do in the wrestling department. Get him down and wrestle him, because Nate struggled with wrestlers. Well, Nate's very good in the clinch. He's made it very difficult for people to try and get him down, because then when you get him down, you have to deal with his very tricky guard, which he's more than capable of submitting guys off of his back. So I just wanted to bring up those points, really, is that he's come a long way. Wrestling is still a hole in his game. I think it'll be interesting to see how he fares against a Frankie Edgar or a Henderson, whoever is the champion at that certain time, if that matchup is to happen, if Nate is still at the top of the division and a top contender. So those are just a couple of points I did want to bring up. And there was one more thing, a couple more things I did want to talk about, is that this whole Nick and Nate comparison is that, oh, well, Nate will never be better than Nick. Nick's the better Diaz brother. And I'm a big fan of both fighters. I think they're both very good fighters. Now, this has nothing to do with their antics or what they do. I think they're good fighters in the octagon. They come to fight and they put on exciting fights. However, I would love for one day for Nate Diaz to be his own fighter. Now, I know he credits his brother with a lot of his success, which he most definitely should, but I would like to look at Nate Diaz and Nick Diaz as two separate fighters. They're very similar fighting style-wise, and they're very similar attitude-wise. Quick joke is that, well, Nate does show up for his fights, but anyway, is that, or not the fights, Nate does show up for the conferences and all that other stuff, but anyway, is that I would just love to see where it could not just be those two hand in hand. I know it's what Nate wants, is that Nate has a lot of respect and shows a lot of credit for his brother, but I would love for Nate Diaz to be his own fighter. That's what I'm trying to say. And last point I wanted to bring up is, where's Nate Diaz now? Nate Diaz said he wants some time off after his fight. He said he would wait around for a title shot against the winner of Ben Henderson versus Frankie Edgar. Now, I think this makes some sense. I would love to see Nate Diaz fight as soon as possible. However, at the same time, is that, people want to see Nate Diaz fight. And I think he's been fighting a lot. He fights. He always answers the call when it comes time to fight, and he does want some time off. But if there is a fight that people have been talking about, is that Nate should fight Anthony Pettis for the right to top contender. Now, this would be an exciting fight, but if you're weighing this up, and there's no doubting Anthony Pettis' talent. However, I think Nate has had a couple more impressive wins than Anthony Pettis. Now, Anthony Pettis obviously lost to Clay Guida. Also, Nate Diaz lost to Clay Guida. But I think in regards to the Gomi, the Cerrone, and the Jim Miller fight, I just think that Nate could very well be the clear-cut top contender in a very deep lightweight division. So that's just my honest take on that situation. However, if Nate is to fight Anthony Pettis, I think this would be a fight that the fans would want to see. I think it's a fight that can make sense, but I still have Nate Diaz ranked a little bit higher in the top contender chart, or just in the lightweight division rankings, in my honest opinion. So we'll see what happens. Honestly, Nate Diaz is coming into his own. He's turning into outstanding mixed martial arts. He still has a lot more growing to do. Eventually, he will hit that prime or that peak of his game, and he's going to put forth some impressive performances. So I'm not here to say that Nate's going to be the next champion, but I'm telling us all to sit back and enjoy the ride, because Nate Diaz has come forward. He's put on some very impressive fights and will continue to put on some impressive fights. And I'm glad he's finally found a home in the lightweight division. And that's really what I have in regards to the whole situation in regards to Nate Diaz. And that's what I have for this edition. It's Kyle Delaney signing off. I'm out of here.